Welcome to Glass in Session. This podcast is here to help you fortify your wine studies and arm you with wine buying savvy and have a little fun doing it. Wine can be such an incredible fun journey, and I'm so happy to be part of yours. I'm your host, Val, and I thank you for joining me. Clearly, I'm in the middle of a pink fever dream this summer, and it's fair to say that some type of rosé has showed up in nearly every session, from Clos Sabon from Provence in the Yeast Feast in the kickoff episode in Session 1, a brief mention of pink vermouth in Session 2 on aromatized wines. Italy's Rosado was all up in Season 3, and the Southern Rhone Tavel was the subject of last session's Memory Palace episode. And if you're still having nightmares about the Sphinx in our living room, my apologies. But this week, there are no creepy sphinxes, no worms or wormwood, and no yeast feasts. There's a wine fountain, however, and a brief visit to a monastery. So just in case you were thinking I was going to get too weird, well, you know. But I'm still pulling on that pink thread and bringing it home because we're in Spain this week with Rosado, and that is Rosado, as opposed to Italy's Rosato, Rosato. And you might be wondering by now if there's going to be a fringe element. Well, of course there is, because that is my thing. So where in Spain are we going? We're going to Cariñena. And I have to say, before I go any further, it was quite serendipitous that as I was on this rosé roll this summer, Stephanie at Gregory Plus Vine reached out with some lovely pink wine from Cariñena. This is why it's important to connect with people from different sectors of the wine world. It keeps your mind open and it keeps it active, and it really does expand your options. So even though I had a lovely stay in this part of Spain, at a monastery, mind you, my mind was wild with ideas for this podcast, and this was absolutely nowhere on my radar this season, which made me think that it's probably nowhere on your drinking radar either. Or maybe it is, depending on your own wine experiences and your focuses. So if you've been exploring the world of wine for any length of time, you know what I'm talking about. Somebody's going to tweet or Instagram a bottle of, whoa, what's that? What grape is that? Where's that from? Can I get that here? Or maybe you studied these regions in a course or had to answer a question on them on a test or an app somewhere. But for one reason or another, this one may not have stuck with you, because who does remember the thousands of wine appellations, grapes, and styles out there? Not this girl. Although if you paid attention last week and used that Memory Palace episode, you could get a pretty good head start. But this week, we're going to detour to the hot, dry region of Cariñena. First, some cute Cariñena cues. Cariñena is the name of a village in the province of Zaragoza. This town is the oldest in Aragon and one of the oldest in Spain, and it was founded by the Romans. Now, Zaragoza is one of the 3 provinces that makes up the Aragon region in the Ebro River Valley in northeastern Spain. It's also a town, and my friend Maribel is from there. Ciao, Maribel. Now, Aragon has 4 primarily Grenache-driven denominations, or DOs. They've got Somontano, Calatayud, Campo de Borja, and Cariñena. Cariñena, again, it's a village, but it's also a wine region in the Aragon region there. And it's located on an 82 square mile plain with about 14,400 hectares under vine. It's the largest and oldest of the Aragon DOs and the second oldest in Spain, on elevations ranging from about 1,300 to 2,600 feet. Cariñena is also the name for the Carignan grape, which also originates in Aragon. Are you tracking this? In other parts of Spain, the Cariñena is known as Mazuelo. So I'm going to wrap it up with a pretty pink bow, and then I'll kind of narrow the focus a little bit more. Cariñena is at once a village, a wine region, and is the name of a grape. And although Cariñena is grown in Cariñena, the extreme continental climate does scream for garnacha. And garnacha dominates the plantings with about 55% of the vineyards, more than half. This is where we're going to narrow our focus. Garnacha is what we all know as Grenache, which incidentally also originated in Spain. There are some arguments that originated in Italy on the island of Sardinia, where it is known as Cannonau. However, the preponderance of the evidence does point toward Spain as its original country, and it has to do with clones and mutations and things like that. Its first mentions in Spanish literature, where it was referred to as Aragonés, were reported to be in the 16th century agriculture reference by Gabriel Alonso Herrera. It showed up in the 17th century under the name Garnacha in a Cervantes story. So, while we can locate documentation about the grape and its presence as far back as 1513, we know, Guess who? The Romans. The Romans were hanging out here. In fact, modern-day Cariñena was the Roman town of Carrhae, C-A-R-A-E, and that's where the name comes from. And this would be way back in the 3rd century BC. So back then, they were mixing wine with honey and probably some other things, spices, things like that, giving what we learned back in session 2 on aromatized wines. I'm chuffed to bits to get into this first cork dork alert, however. We talked about 3 grenaches in the Tavel episode, but did you know there are actually five garnaches, or should I say mutations? The first one is the black tinta. There they call it red Grenache, but in the last session, remember, I called it Grenache Noir or black Grenache because guess what? It's the same grape. Here, they just call it Tinta. Then we've got the white one, which we talked about last week, or here it's called the Blanca. And then we've got Gray or Grenache Gris. It's not as well planted here, but it does make a nice Vin Gris or light rosé wine. But this next one just cracks me up. This is Peluda. This is hairy Grenache. I know, right? Now, the grape itself isn't hairy because you were thinking that, weren't you? The down or the hair is actually on the leaves, or more specifically on the back or the underside of the leaves. But it is a mutation of the Garnacha tinta, and the wines from this variety are prone to oxidation and don't regularly achieve high alcohol levels in the finished wines, despite the climate. And then finally, we have the Tintorera. You've heard of this before. It's the Alicante Boucher. This is one of those tenturiers. And remember, a tenturier has the red pulp, or the juice will run, a dark pink, because remember, all grapes otherwise have clear juice, regardless of skin color, with the exception of tenturiers, like Tintorera. So we've got the black or tinta, the white or blanca, the gray, the peluda or hairy, and the Tintorera, or what we call Alicante Boucher. Cork Dork alerts make me so thirsty, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this wine, and then I'm going to throw you with some facts and figures and a little history. I know, can't wait, right? This would be a good time to get something in your glass, unless you're driving, of course, or if you're at work where employers get all uppity about sipping rosé during duty hours. But we're going to talk about this wine now because speaking of garnacha, in my glass is a particular Garnacha Rosé. It's actually called Particular, as Particular makes up a series of wines from Bodega San Valero. San Valero dates back to the 1940s and is one of the first and greatest producers and top producers to this day, credited to leading the modernization efforts in the Cariñena DO. Now, this rosé is very different from the dark cherry pinks I talked about in the previous 2 sessions, or even the pale Provençal types or the other styles that are more salmon pink. This one's got a unique color to it. It's almost got like a lavender or bluish hue to the pink. You know how you've got orange pink, like ballet pink, and then you've got kind of a nice soft pale, like a blue pink, just like you have blue reds and orange reds. There are different hues to the colors. That's what I'm talking about. So this one only spent a few hours on those dark Garnacha Tinta skins, but it's got that ripe, red, juicy summer fruit and floral notes we love in a Pinot. It's got the spicy notes like pepper of a Syrah. And then on the palate, that citrus zest and medium plus refreshing zip of acidity from a well-made balanced rosé. There's this chalky element in the flavor almost. So if you were around chalkboards a lot as a kid, and some of us who are showing my age here, had to dust those chalks, had to dust those chalk erasers after class by clapping them together, and you're breathing in all that chalk dust. So I know that smell well. And then there's that savory note and that salinity on the palate that carries through to the super long finish. In fact, I noticed when I took a sip of this, I poured some last night just to kind of make my notes here. But when I poured some and I took a sip and I swallowed and then I ran my tongue around my teeth, I could still taste the wine. It was crazy. The verdict, this is a really great food wine, but I actually enjoy just kind of sipping and snacking. Or to quote my hubby after I poured him a taste, he goes, "That's a well-made wine." So there you go. That's the verdict. Because this rosé version of Garnacha, I would put this with a nice pasta salad with maybe a little bit of a vinaigrette or a crab salad. Or you know where I'm going here? Tapas. Because in Basque Country, this is what they do. And you're in the Basque Country area here. And although in Basque Country, tapas are called pinchos, I should point that out. Pintxos. It's popular in Spain, and it's kind of one of my favorite ways to eat. And there are tapas restaurants popping up in a lot of other places too, especially in the larger cities. And even here in Colorado Springs, they have a nice tapas restaurant with a pretty cool selection of Spanish wines and sherries, I should say. But some of my recommendations, besides anything wrapped in jamon, or the ham, trust me on this, would be some of these classic tapas dishes. Everywhere you go in Spain, there's going to be a version of patatas bravas. It's these potatoes, and they're in this red, chili sauce. Sometimes it's creamy, sometimes it's more tomatoey, and I order it everywhere I go because it's always different. Sometimes it's really, really spicy, and that might kill your palate for the wine. But if you're drinking a nice, cool rosé, I think it's going to be fine anyway. Another classic favorite, torta española. We went out of our way to make this for our housewarming. We had a whole tapas theme when we moved into our house, which incidentally was the same year we went to Spain. So we were just sold on these kind of foods. And a torta española, it's kind of like a Spanish omelet, but this one we made was loaded with layers of potatoes. So it took a long time to get the mandolin out and slice up all these potatoes. But it's a really, really great dish to have with a Spanish rosé. Or if you're so inclined, classic, easy pan con tomate. Now, this is a nice rustic bread. It's toasted, and then you rub it with garlic, and then you smear it, like you literally rub the tomato on the bread. You smear it. And you should see my hand motions right now. It's crazy. I'm like smearing tomatoes on this rough piece of bread that's been rubbed with garlic. And then you drizzle it with really good olive oil. Not grocery store olive oil, mind you. Good olive oil. Look for a harvest date on the bottle. These rosés aren't likely to be too high in alcohol, which makes them a really great summer treat. So if you're going to do like a tapas party or have some seafood or paella, this is a really good choice. But honestly, you can have it with cauliflower pizza and turkey pepperoni, because I did that too. I did read that Spanish winemakers are using carbonic maceration or whole berry fermentation for this. That's a whole juicy cork dork podcast in and of itself. But I didn't pick up any of those notes that I normally get in a carbonic macerated wine. Something like you would pick up in a Beaujolais Nouveau, like the banana or the candy notes. And in past episodes, I also talked about saignée, or the bleeding method, which is also used here in Spain, along with the direct press technique or some other tricks of the trade like surly or oak aging. Again, the particular is more of a drink now, enjoy now style, not overly cerebral, quite youthful and fresh. And that, I hate to say the word minerality, but this wine practically embodies that properly. And it really does express what's going on there in the land, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So again, this wine in the summer with Mahone, Iberico, and Manchego cheese all day, stuffed piquillo peppers, tuna with olives and capers, dried figs, Marcona almonds, which I was just snacking on, or some of my favorite easy light summer snacks with a rosé like this. I would advise you to experiment with your food because it's got a nice acidity in this wine. It's got about a medium body on it, so you could really pair this with many summer foods, but I think seafood is what the producer recommends. So again, depends on the sauce and all the elements, the components, textures, and flavors of that dish. So if I just made you hungry and you're off to get a snack, just hit pause because it's time for another cork dork moment. A few other fun facts about Spanish pink wines. Of the 4 countries that make up 80% of the world's rosé production, as of about 5 years ago, Spain was second behind France. The next 2, of course, would be US and Italy. So Spain was producing about 20% of the world's rosé, but only consuming about 10%. And here's another kicker. They export a lot of rosé to the point where their Rosado comprised 46.3% of all exports, nearly half. Those rosé figures are according to the only OIV, or International Organization of Vine and Wine report, that I could get my hands on that really references rosé wine specifically. Remember, in these reports, they usually break wine down by red and white. So I've linked that report in the show notes, just in case you like to pour a glass later, kick back, and cruise pie charts, bar charts, line graphs, and tables just for fun. You know you do, or you wouldn't be still listening to the show. #am I right? But these figures could explain why I saw very few rosé choices in the many tapas bars I skulked. And let me tell you, skulk the tapas bars and wine lists I did like it was a sport. There might have been a rosé in the wine bar in the monastery, but I can't remember what it was, and I can barely remember. I just remember the scene, and there was just not a lot to choose from, and the guy behind the bar was a little grouchy. But what, did you think I would sleep in a monastery with no bar? Again, I can't remember what it was. It could have been from neighboring Calatayud, and there was even a rosé or a Rioja on the restaurant's menu that we drank that night at dinner. Also, I'd like to take this opportunity to apologize for the dent I made in the pork supply in Spain as well as the wine supply, because I'm pretty sure had I seen more Rosado next to some of that beautiful Jamón Ibérico, I probably could have single-handedly skewed those OIV figures for 2012. But remember, we're still in Cariñena. Cariñena was named a DOP, or Protected Wine Region, in 2011, which means there are extra guarantees or regulations with respect to grape growing and winemaking processes. Within Cariñena, there are 14 growing regions, and I'm going to cover them all for you today. No, I'm not. But Cariñena does account for most of the plantings of old vine Grenache in Spain. And some of these vines are over 100 years old, and they're fantastic to see. But what about the white grapes, Val? Yes, they grow those too. About 20% of the plantings are white grapes, including Viura, which some of us in the Cava world know as Macabeo, Garnacha Blanca, which I talked about earlier, and even Chardonnay. In fact, I happen to have a Chardonnay here too. It's a Fabula de Panizza, and it's grown in the chalk, schist, and clay soils of the Iberian mountain foothills. Now, I'm going to save this one for another day, however, because this is a Rosado episode. But there is a text sheet that mentions butterscotch notes or Werther's Original, so we can see where that episode is probably going to go in the future. But I should mention that Panizza is also a top producer, dating back to 1953, and they also produce garnacha-based rosados. So thank you for sending that wine too. I cannot wait to dig into that in another episode. But let's go back to the soils, because that monastery I mentioned earlier, the one I stayed at is actually called Monasteria de Piedra, which means monastery of stone. Cariñena actually promoted their wines in 2012 as the wine of stones, El Vino de las Piedras, and this is due to the soils there. So not only are the schist and chalk common here that I mentioned earlier from the Panizza, but 80% of the soils contain about 4 types of clay, and they range from composites of quartzite and slate to sandstone compositions and giant stones. I should also mention that the Monastery de Piedra is really about 50 miles from the town of Cariñena near Zaragoza, and it's more in the neighboring Calatayud region. So it's not actually in Cariñena, but it's pretty close. And I thought it was tied in really nicely with the story. But for those of you wondering, no, there was no lightning and the monastery did not burn down. Thank you very much. But why are monasteries an important element to the wines of Cariñena? This is how I'm going to tie it in, because like many wine regions, monks were a vital part of the development and growth of wine culture and traditions. The same is true in this part of Spain, and this part of Spain has a beverage history dating back to the Middle Ages, if not further. Another fringy fact about the history of Cariñena, it dates back to 1585, and this is when King Philip II came to visit, and he was greeted by, are you ready for this? Wine fountains. I said wine fountains. One was flowing with red wine and the other was said to be flowing with white wine. But to this day, every September, La Fuente de la Mora, or the fountain in Cariñena, still flows with wine to celebrate the harvest, or La Fiesta de la Vendimia. This festival has been organized by the Consejo Regulador, or the Regulatory Council of DOP Cariñena, for the past 44 years, but it's actually been a tradition since 1960. So there you go. You can go, but the dates actually vary each year depending on the harvest, and I'll put some links in the show notes for you. But what a takeaway, a wine fountain, a fountain that actually flows wine. I've got one more regional takeaway as far as Garnacha Rosé. Of the wine regions producing Rosado from Garnacha, Cariñena comes in third after Somontano and Campo de Borja. Deborah Parker Wong actually wrote this really beautiful article on a Garnacha Grenache site called Summer's Best Kept Secrets. And so I'm going to link that one up for you in the show notes too. So where does that leave us this week? In addition to being a cool town with a wine fountain founded by the Romans and a grape named after said town, the wine region of Cariñena is making some fabulous rosé from Garnacha. It's meant to be enjoyed with food and friends, and I hope this episode did a little bit to put this on your radar and kind of expand your summer drink pink portfolio, if you will. It took me 20 minutes to say all that, because of course it did. But I have to send another thank you out to Stephanie at Gregory Plus Vine and the folks at Cariñena, the Wine Region to Watch campaign, Bodegas San Valero and Bodegas Panizza for these beautiful wines, and most importantly to you for clicking play, all your kind words during the spin-up of this winecast, and all the fun interactions on social media. As this airs, I will be getting ready for some hiking and goofing off in Durango before digging into the Diwa for session 6. So I hope you're enjoying your summer. I hope you're finding all kinds of fun and delicious things in your glass. And to that, I will say cheers. Reach out to me between sessions at val@glassandsession.com or on Twitter at WineGalUnboxed. On the Facebook, Pinterest, and Insta Spaces, I'm Vino with Val. Glass and Session is trademarked by Vino with Val, LLC. Music is by Addict Sound. Website is glassandsession.com/podcast.